Look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. In its brief course lie all the verities and realities of your existence. The bliss of growth, the glory of action, the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is but a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But today well lived makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day. I am the Reverend Dr. Anthony Johnson, and I welcome you to this virtual worship service of the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg. Because of the continuing danger of the coronavirus, the building remains closed. But the church is open, with a full schedule of programs and activities. Today and every Sunday, there is a live virtual coffee hour from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Please read news you can use and other emails you receive from the church, and please check the website regularly. Please send your joy or sorrow via the link in the email you received and indicate whether you give permission for it to be read in the next week's service. Because of uncertainty about the election and its outcome, next Sunday's service will be live streamed beginning at 10:30 a.m. It will be recorded for viewing during the week following. If you are a visitor or newcomer, I invite you to explore the website uchbg.org to learn more about the church and its many activities. Whoever you are, wherever you live, whomever you love, whatever you do for a living, you are welcome at the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg.
Hello, my name is Teresa Alberisi, and I'll be your lay liturgist for today. I invite those of you at home to light a chalice, a candle, or whatever you choose to serve as your chalice at home. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together. Please join me in the reading of the unison affirmation. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is our gift. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to speak our truths in love, and to help one another.
Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, sparkle for each soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole.
Hello, my name is Corey and I serve as your Director of Religious Exploration. Today's story is titled A Kid's Book About Voting by Next Up. Voting is so important and we often underestimate its power. Through voting, we decide what people and ideas mold and influence our day-to-day lives, which is why it's so crucial that we not only understand what voting is, but also its history. Young people are so imaginative, and there is no end to their potential. So when you teach kids about voting, they can discover solutions to the problems we face and imagine what voting can be when it's their turn to make the decisions. The younger people are when they develop their civic habits, the more likely they are to become lifelong habitual voters. Let's begin our story. Hello. We are a group of young people who care about making positive changes in the world. One of the ways we do this is by helping young people understand everything there is to know about voting, even kids. But we've already gotten ahead of ourselves. You probably want to know what voting is. Well, voting is how you show your support for a person or idea. You do this with something called a vote. A vote, simply put, is a choice for something or someone, like, should we have pizza for dinner? Yes or no? What for do you vote? Well, things like ideas, laws, and even presidents. Well, how do you vote? Well, this depends on where you live. Sometimes you will fill in bubbles on a piece of paper and then mail it in. Other times you vote in person on a computer. So who gets to vote? Well, that's a little bit more complicated. When our country, the United States of America, was founded, it was really messy. Okay, well, it was a little bit more than messy. Let us explain. Before the USA existed, many European countries used America for land, wealth, and power, and that is called colonialism. But there were people who already lived in America who today we call indigenous. Those indigenous people were forced out of their lands, and a majority of them were even killed. Europeans also brought people from Africa and forced them into slavery. Slavery is when someone is forced to work but isn't paid and no longer has their freedom. We told you it was a little bit more than messy. After a while, the people from Europe wanted even more power, so they created their own country, the United States of America. They made their own rules and decided who got to vote on them. To do this, in 1789, they wrote a document called the Constitution. The Constitution laid out the laws of the land that everyone had to follow. It also stated who could vote. Can you guess who got the right to vote from the Constitution? You're right, white men. White men who also owned land and paid taxes, which accounted for only 6% of all the people in the country at that time. If you were a grown-up in 1789, would you have been allowed to vote? How about your best friends, your teachers, your parents? Does that seem right to you? Many people in our country haven't been able to vote because of their race, age, gender, religion, wealth, language, citizenship, or physical ability. But who can vote has changed over time. It wasn't until almost 100 years after the Constitution was written that black men got the right to vote. 50 years after that, in 1920, white women were finally allowed to vote. Then in 1924, a new law was made that gave indigenous people citizenship and the right to vote, but many states kept them from voting until 1957. Even after all of this, it still didn't mean that every black man, white woman, and indigenous person got the right to vote. A lot of them were still left out. Eventually, more groups of people got to vote. Like in 1952, Asian people gained citizenship and the right to vote. 1965, the Voting Rights Act said there couldn't be any barriers to anyone voting, which was in theory. The age of voting changed from 21 to 18 in 1970. In 1975, Latinx people gained the right to vote. Up till then, you couldn't vote if you couldn't read or write in English. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act ensured that individuals with disabilities could vote. We want you to pause and think about this for a minute. Stop, breathe, reflect. Does it seem right to you that it took so long for so many people to get a chance to vote? We think it's outrageous, unfair, and simply not right. But we're hopeful because it shows that things can change. Still, not everyone can vote, but now more people than ever can. In the future, we hope that even more people will get the right to vote, because, believe it or not, some still don't. How? Well, through new laws, our government and people working together to make change happen. And how do new laws and governments get formed? Through voting. Yes, there are lots of different things you'll get to vote for when you're a grown-up, like who is the President of the United States, who the mayor of your city is, and so many more things like parks, schools, judges, senators, playgrounds, rule changes, governors, sheriffs, money, and on and on and on. Voting happens all the time, and each time is for something different. Almost every year we vote for local things. Every 4 years we vote for a president. Every 6 years we vote for our United States senators. Voting is one of the most important things that you can do. It's just not using your voice, but something even more special, your power. Yes, you are powerful. When you vote, you use your power for what you believe in, whether it's an idea or person or movement. When you get to vote, it will be because many people fought to give you that right. When we vote, individual voices come together to make a bigger sound. Voting allows us to advocate for people and issues we believe in. It just doesn't happen with one vote, but many, 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 which means your vote eventually, when you can, is so important. Because sometimes something wins by just one vote, or 7 or 3,000. So your vote matters, but sadly, not everyone who can vote does. For example, during big elections, like for president, only about half of the people vote. So what will you do when you grow up? Will you use your voice? Stand up for what you believe in? Vote? Well, I hope that you can do all of these things. Thank you for being here today.
was younger, I equated the word democracy with freedom. Like most of us, I learned that our country is a democracy and that it provided opportunities, freedoms that were so special that many people left their country and emigrated to ours just so they could have a better living. In fact, my father was one of those people coming through Ellis Island along with his mother and his brothers and sisters. Fortunately, they were allowed in the country and eventually became citizens. As I became older, I realized that a democracy is not equal to freedom. That a democratic government means that we have a right to vote for people and the type of government we want, but that the government does not necessarily guarantee freedom or guarantee freedom that it was equally applicable to all people. My parents taught me that we were all equal and that we should treat each other so. So this was quite a realization. I was so disappointed, really ashamed. Why were so freedoms unavailable to so many people? I remember thinking that this is not what our country is supposed to be about, but I had faith that we would get better in the future. I had my first really in-your-face moment when I was in high school. The summer after my freshman year, I tutored in a poor area of South Philadelphia. During the summer, I became friends with Valerie, who was also a tutor, and she happened to be Black. We really began to socialize quite often, but we realized that we could never visit each other's houses because we would not be welcome in each other's neighborhoods. This was really sad. So we limited our socialization to Center City, Philadelphia, where we went about ordering integrated ice cream sodas, black and white ice cream sodas for those of you who don't know, and thought we were really cool. But in the back of our minds, we realized that Valerie and her family really didn't have the rights that they should have. It was a sad commentary on the behaviors and attitudes in our society. And in fact, there were protests that summer and some violence because people were frustrated. When would there be true equality? Another gotcha moment was again in high school. I wanted to go to college and I was very concerned about how I would pay for college tuition. I thought joining the service would be an option. So on career day, I went out to get information. So I went to the area where they were going to have the representatives from the Navy and the Marines and Army, etc. And there were two rooms. One small room that said secretaries and nurses, and another larger room for everyone else. Well, I went into the larger room and I found that I was the only woman, only girl in with literally several hundred boys. And I saw the representative of the different services whispering to each other. And finally, one came to me and said, "You don't belong in this room. This room is only for, you're a woman. You need to go over to be a nurse or a secretary." And I said, "No, I don't want to be a nurse or a secretary. I want to specialize in languages." And they told me I wasn't allowed to. Women were not allowed to do anything in the service at that time except be nurses and secretaries, which are great, but not what I wanted. What? I was shocked. Then years later, after college, another oh no moment. I fell in love. And this should have been a joyous occasion, but I fell in love with a woman. And yes, it was joyous, but it was also tinged with fear and guilt. This was not accepted by society at all at the time. It was against the law in some states. And even in Pennsylvania, I realized that I could lose my job or be kicked out of housing or even refused housing because I was in love with a woman. Once again, our democracy fell short, but the freedom to protest became even more important and even more personal. The most recent in-your-face moment for me came when we adopted children who happened to be Black. So we now are a multiracial family. We face legal limitations, but also some societal issues as well. We had to go through so many extra precautions because only one of us could legally adopt at the time. And frankly, some people didn't like that we adopted children of a different race. But still, we were optimistic that this would change. Lucky for us, things did change. There are more rights now for same-sex couples. Same-sex adoption and same-sex marriages are now legal. The housing and job situation, though, is still a little bit precarious. And of course, trans still have very few rights. Our family is fine. We were incredibly fortunate. We are supported by friends, family, and a wonderful community. But that's not true for everyone. As an adult, I understand that changing the law is incredibly important. But just as important is changing interpretations of the law and changing attitudes and behavior. All people are still not equal in this country. That there is need to protest to gain basic freedoms for so many people is really just unbelievable, frustrating, and like most of us, makes me disgusted and angry at the same time. It's a call to action. But there is still hope. The very fact that protests are occurring throughout the country and that Black Lives Matter movement is so strong, the fact that protesters are so diverse in race and age and religion, and they're from the urban, suburban, and rural areas, shows me that the belief or faith in our country to change is still strong. I have to believe that this faith in each other, our democracy will ultimately create a country with equality for all, and a country that rejoices in our diversity.
Today in this congregation, someone is hurting or in sorrow. Today in this congregation, someone is anxious because of events in the world. Today in this congregation, someone is lonely. Today in this congregation, someone is filled with joy and wants to celebrate. For all the fear and sorrow and uncertainty in the world today, there are moments of joy. This past week, Jim and Nan Kavanaugh celebrated their 55th wedding anniversary. Congratulations to them. We've heard the words of the people who in love and trust, the people who have placed joy or sorrow before this community and before the holy. Love for those whose names have been spoken and love for those who hear. Trust in the acceptance of this community and trust in the continuity of life. Where there is birth, life goes on. Where there is death, life goes on. Where there is joy, life goes on. Where there is sorrow, life goes on. May we always live in trust and in love, that all joy may be shared and all sorrow may be comforted. Blessed be. Amen. In 1944, people could begin to look beyond the Second World War, which would still last another year. In 1944, the historian John Hope Franklin published an article titled History, Weapon of War and Peace. History, he noted, had been used to justify, energize, and win in war. In this article, he argued that it could also be a weapon for peace. A liberal in his thinking, Franklin, like many of his peers, believed that the human being was perfectible and inherently good. The final paragraph of his essay begins with these words. Democracy is essentially an act of faith. Democratic institutions are predicated on the perfectionability of man as well as his inherent goodness. The historical process in emphasizing the movement of man toward perfection finds a congenial atmosphere among democratic processes. His peers included the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who, also in 1944, declared, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Both of these 20th century scholars, the historian and the theologian, were well-known public intellectuals and committed to making peace and justice in the world. Both shared a faith in democracy, and because they lived in a world that was far from perfect, their vigorous participation in democracy was itself an act of faith. Their faith in democracy was strong. Faith is an orientation of personality that enables an individual to have a sense of meaning in life, whatever the circumstances in this moment or another. Democracy is an act of faith, not because the voter expects their candidate to win the particular election or the tally of votes cast in a referendum to go the right way. It is an act of faith because your vote matters. My vote matters, even when we are on the losing side of the vote. It matters that we look at the issues, study the candidates, and make the decision to vote one way or another. It matters that we talk with others about the issues and the candidates. It matters that we talk with people with whom we agree and with people with whom we disagree. It matters when we are on the losing side of a vote, because it affirms that in a democracy, there is, in many instances, more than one legitimate position or choice. Political conversations matter because discussion makes our own thinking clearer. Discussion makes someone perhaps change their mind. And perhaps when we speak with each other, even when we disagree, we stay in relationship. There are settings where these conversations can happen, and there are settings where they cannot happen. In my column in the November issue of The Reporter, I talked about my last trip last week to Waterbury, Connecticut, to bury my sister Debbie's ashes. Among the family gathered there are strong political opinions, and the opinions are not unanimous. There might be a good time and setting to talk politics among family members, but that was neither the time nor the setting. There are times when political talk can and should happen. Before the pandemic, bars were a good place for that. But also public forums and panels of candidates for office or advocates for one side of an issue or another. I suspect today that everyone's mind is on the presidential election this coming Tuesday. I expect that many of you watching this on YouTube have already voted. I delivered my ballot to the lockbox a week ago Friday. In some states, people have been voting in person already. All forms of news media have been reporting on the large volume of mail-in ballots and the long lines for early in-person voting in states across the country. I read in Friday's New York Times that 3 million mail-in ballots had been requested in Pennsylvania. People are fired up about this election. But this is not just a national election. Your member of Congress is up for re-election. One of my senators is. There are local elected bodies that have a lot of power in our communities. In my city, there are 9 candidates competing for 3 seats on the Board of Education. In my county, there are 5 seats open on the Board of Chosen Freeholders, the county government. A friend who lives in Chicago, in one of the suburbs of Chicago, carefully studied the candidates who are running for elected judgeships. Democracy is an act of faith. This basic act of citizenship, voting, matters. Your vote matters. I get frustrated with people who are eligible to vote but who do not vote. In the current issue of The Nation, Dorian T. Warren writes that for Black Americans, being a voter is not just a privilege of citizenship. It is part of one's identity as a citizen. This matters deeply for those whose ancestors were slaves. Warren notes that since the 1960s, in the former Confederate states, in 4 presidential elections, Black voter turnout exceeded white voter turnout. But one side in the 2020 electoral cycle has been working to suppress Black votes. He writes, and I quote, "The brigade to suppress voters of color is coming from the president and the GOP and their right-wing accomplices. Trump openly disparages vote by mail ballots and urges his supporters to intimidate poll watchers and voters at polling stations, efforts aimed at corrupting the election process. As poll after poll shows Trump losing ground by wide margins. The GOP is trying to subvert the election by making it hardest to vote for people they know are most likely to cast a ballot the other way." End of quote. Friday's Times included many column inches, in fact, a full half page, describing Republican voter suppression tactics in Pennsylvania. If you have not read it, I encourage you to go online and read it. Senator Lena C. Taylor, a member of the Wisconsin State Senate, writes of how our nation is composed of people of many different faiths who share one faith in democracy. Today, and here I quote her, "Today our faith is tested. The fair application of the Constitution, Supreme Court appointments, and whether we can trust legislators to represent our interests is being tested. Our faith in our voting systems and our very form of democracy is being tested. As men and women of good conscience, moral character, and basic human decency, we and our faith are being tested. And whether that faith is based in religion or mankind, it is possible to become disillusioned and faithless, or both." End of quote. Now, I remember when 2 years ago the midterm elections were approaching. It had become abundantly clear how amoral, corrupt, and destructive the Trump presidency was. It tested people's faith. A single party held the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Jody Light and I attended a performance at the People's Voice Cafe in Manhattan. That evening, Steve Suffett, a folk singer, took the stage, but before singing, he spoke. He told us how he kept hearing from people who were dismayed and dispirited by the Trump administration. People who said these were such dismal times that they were too discouraged to act. Steve reminded the audience of the 1850s. He recounted the evils of that time. Slavery was legal, women could not vote. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. President Millard Fillmore, a Unitarian, signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which in effect deputized all Northerners to be slave catchers. The Missouri Compromise limited the spread of slavery, but also confirmed its legitimacy. By the end of the 1850s, civil war was looming. It was a terrible decade, but people got through it and much more, and eventually won significant victories. It was not easy in that decade, and it is not easy in this decade. I am talking about more than surviving the Trump administration. I am talking about the threats and dangers of climate change, xenophobia, prejudice, white supremacy, heterosexism, patriarchy, and endless undeclared wars. I understand when Senator Taylor talks about becoming disillusioned and faithless. The present administration in Washington is dominated by a white supremacist patriarchy that bullies those who do not fall into line. However, I remember that since the birth of the Republic, there have been struggles that have led to advances, but there have also been losses, steps backward, and lost ground. In her 2018 Beacon Press book, History Teaches Us to Resist: How Progressive Movements Have Succeeded in Challenging Times, Mary Frances Berry recounts victories achieved for social and political progress in the 20th and early 21st centuries. Many of the movements that achieved these advances, many of their actions were in the streets, but they eventually achieved laws and policies in government and changes in society as a whole. Reading these stories will strengthen a person's faith in democracy and remind the reader that the practice of democracy is much more than the act of voting. Democracy is about more than voting, though voting is essential. It is about acting for change in many times, many places, many settings. The civil rights legislation enacted during Lyndon Johnson's presidency won the votes it needed in the House and the Senate. It won those votes because thousands of men, women, and children, black and white, had exercised democracy in the streets. The marches, civil disobedience, prayers, voter registration drives, and speeches constituted democracy as an act of faith. To those who resisted change, the marches, the demonstrations, the speeches, the civil disobedience were threatening, and they labeled them as anarchy. Their responses to demonstrations in 2020 are the same. They label them as anarchy. Now, please bear in mind that anarchism is not rioting in the streets. One might fairly use the word anarchy to describe such behavior, but they keep talking about anarchism. I haven't seen a sufficient breakdown in order to warrant the label of anarchy for what is happening in the streets. I will remind you that anarchism is a serious and critical philosophy that asserts that people have the rights of freedom and self-governance without the need for approval by law or state, and that people have the capacity to act on their rights and freedom and to maintain society. It is the most radically democratic of all political philosophy. It is not about rioting in the streets. It is about the rights of all. The poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti is a pacifist who long identified as an anarchist, but he eventually concluded that anarchism would only work if everyone were a saint. However, as a naval officer during the Second World War, he had learned that not everyone is a saint. It was that war that turned him from jingoistic patriotism to anarchism and pacifism. And years later, he concluded that we need democracy in a more structured form than a pure anarchist philosophy allows for. The form, in his judgment, was democratic socialism, or as he later phrased it, in the memoir he published in honor of his 100th birthday last year, a humanitarian socialism as a creed to live by. I began this sermon with words written by the great historian John Hope Franklin. Democracy is essentially an act of faith. Democracy is an act of faith in two ways. First, we who practice democracy take actions whose outcomes are not certain. We take these actions because we judge that they are the right thing to do. And if the context in which we take them is fair, we accept that the outcome is legitimate, even when the outcome is not what we wanted. Second, when we act on faith, however things turn out, we know that there is meaning in our acting and in the outcome. The late Senator J. William Fulbright put it this way: in a democracy, dissent is an act of faith. When I was younger, I could heartily believe these two assertions. And I'm not saying they're not true. I am saying the fairness of our democratic system today is in question. Bad faith actors have been systematically and intentionally undermining it since the 1980s, if not longer. Among these bad faith actors in 2020 is the President of the United States. And I am dismayed by the large number of citizens who do not vote. In my lifetime, in most presidential elections, voter turnout has typically been less than 50% of those eligible, and sometimes much lower. In some local and state elections, it has been even lower. In a recent and important municipal election in my city where I live, less than 15% of the registered voters cast a ballot. From the numbers of early voters in the 2020 national election, however, it appears that participation is getting significantly higher than it has been in recent presidential election years. Many citizens are voting, and voting early where that option is available. They are practicing democracy as an act of faith. We will need to be patient this week. I do not believe that the projection of the winning presidential candidate will be possible on the evening of Election Day, or even during the first few days following. There are too many paper ballots to count in too many states to determine quickly the outcome. We will need to be patient, but we cannot be silent. We will need to show up, to show that we are watching the counting, to show that we will not stand for a stop in the counting as happened 20 years ago. We will show up to refute any actors who claim an early and unverified victory. We may well need to fill the streets if that's what it takes. Voting is the formal mechanism of democracy. However, as the civil rights and anti-war movements confirmed, taking the streets can itself be a powerful act of democracy. Democracy is an act of faith. Let us act in faith. Let us act in good faith. And let us act that democracy may survive and prevail this dismal decade. Amen, and blessed be.
Even as you are separated and sitting in your own homes today, the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg is nevertheless a freely gathered church of free people. The church is created, sustained, and supported by you, the people. The church is open even though the building is closed. Each week we share the offering with the community organization. During the month of November, this organization is the Ecumenical Food Pantry. For over 45 years, the Ecumenical Food Pantry has worked to meet the emergency food needs of people in the greater Harrisburg area. At the start of the pandemic, the number of people served at the pantry decreased as temporary food outlets opened. However, the special pandemic food distribution seemed to be ending, and the requests for food at the pantry have again risen. The pantry is currently providing a 3-day supply of food to about 300 households, 900 people every month. The pantry is managed and operated entirely by volunteers. Pantry operations and procedures were completely reworked to keep volunteers and clients safe. The pantry is located at Messiah Lutheran Church in Harrisburg. It is supported by many area churches, businesses, organizations, individuals, and a state grant. Your support is vitally important. Your financial support and commitment matter. Please be generous.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
The call to action comes from the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Lewis, Senior Minister of the Middle Collegiate Church in New York City. These are her words. We have to vote, up ticket and down, for the school board, for sheriff, for city hall, for senators and congresspeople. We have to vote for our sons and daughters, for our old people and ourselves. And we are old, friend. We have to vote for health care, so when other folks' moms get cancer like yours and mine did, that they have health care and support. We have to vote so policing is reformed, so our beautiful black sons and daughters and grandchildren will be able to move freely in the world as though their black lives mattered. We have to vote for Mama Earth so that she flourishes, and we do too. We have to vote so disabled folks have access to all this nation has to offer. We have to vote so our LGBTQIA plus communities are safe to live and love in full humanity. We have to vote for kindness at the border and in our communities. We have to vote because we can, because our ancestors have suffered and struggled to make sure we can. We must vote. And to Jackie Lewis's words, I say, Amen. Let us go forth this day to make this day a day of growth, a day glorified by action, a day of beauty. Let us go forth and live well this day, that it may be for us and for all whom we meet and whose lives we touch, that for all it may be a vision of hope. Amen, and blessed be.